I don't understand. Where's my money? I asked, staring at the nearly empty balance on the banking app. My chest tightened as I scrolled through the transactions again, hoping I'd somehow missed something. But no, the balance was unmistakable. Almost $10,000. The money I'd worked for every summer since high school was gone. Edward, my stepfather, sat across the kitchen table, casually flipping through the mail. He didn't even look up. Relax, Clarice. It's not gone. I moved it into a better account for you. Higher interest and all that. I blinked, trying to process his words. You moved it? Without telling me? He finally glanced up, his expression calm and patronizing. You'll thank me later. It's earning more for you this way. Something about his tone didn't sit right with me. What account? I asked, my voice sharper now. Show me. Oh, it's tied up in some obligations right now, he said, waving his hand dismissively. But don't worry, it's being put to good use. My name is Clarice, and I've been saving for my future since I was 16. I worked every summer, sometimes 2 jobs, juggling shifts at the coffee shop in the mornings and the ice cream stand in the evenings. I'd skipped vacations with friends, passed on new clothes, and ate more ramen than I'd like to admit, all to build my savings. That money was supposed to be my ticket to independence. I didn't know yet if I'd use it for tuition, a down payment on a place of my own, or maybe even a trip to Europe one day. All I knew was that it was mine, and I'd earned every cent of it. Edward and my mom, Margaret, had always been dismissive of my efforts, brushing off my plans with comments like, "You're young, you have time to figure it out." But I'd never thought they'd outright take from me, until now. The full truth came out later that evening. After hours of pestering Edward, I finally cornered Margaret in the living room. Where's my money, Mom? I demanded, my voice trembling with frustration. Edward said he moved it into some account, but he won't tell me where. She hesitated, glancing toward the kitchen where Edward was fixing himself a drink. Look, Clarice, she began, her voice soft but firm. It's not as bad as you think. That's not an answer, I snapped. What did you do with it? Her face tightened, and I knew immediately that whatever she was about to say would make my blood boil. We used it to pay for Emily's tuition, she admitted. Emily? I repeated, stunned. Your stepdaughter? You used my money to pay for her college? She needed it, Clarice, Margaret said defensively. Her financial aid didn't come through, and she was at risk of losing her spot. What were we supposed to do, let her drop out? Yes, I yelled, unable to hold back. She's not my responsibility. That money was for me. How could you think this was okay? Edward appeared in the doorway, holding his drink like it was a prop in some smug performance. You're young, he said, echoing Margaret's favorite excuse. You can always earn it back. Emily didn't have that kind of time. The room spun as their words sank in. Every sleepless night, every blistered hand from double shifts, every penny I'd pinched, it had all been for nothing. They'd taken what was mine and used it to bail out Emily, who, as far as I could tell, had never worked a day in her life. I want it back, I said, my voice cold and steady. Every cent. Edward snorted, taking a sip of his drink. You're being dramatic, Clarice. It's already spent. What do you expect us to do, pull it out of thin air? I don't care how you do it, I shot back. Figure it out. Margaret sighed, rubbing her temples like I was the unreasonable one. Clarice, please. You're acting like we robbed you. We're family. Sometimes sacrifices have to be made. Sacrifices? I snapped. I made sacrifices. I worked for that money. Emily didn't sacrifice anything. You stole it and handed it to her like it was yours to give. That night, I barely slept. I lay in bed replaying the conversation in my head, my anger simmering hotter with every passing hour. By morning, I'd made up my mind. The first call I made was to Danny. I need help, I told her, my voice shaking as I explained what had happened. Her outrage was immediate. They did what? Clarice, that's theft. You need to call a lawyer. The second call I made was to a law firm Danny recommended. The woman I spoke to listened patiently as I poured out the whole story. from Edward's manipulative charm to Margaret's dismissive excuses. "This is a clear case of unauthorized use of funds," the lawyer said after a long pause. "We can definitely pursue legal action, but it'll require some documentation on your part. Do you have access to the account statements?" "Yes," I said, my determination hardening. "I'll send you everything." As I hung up, a strange calm settled over me. I wasn't sure what would come next, but one thing was clear. I wasn't letting them get away with this. Edward and Margaret thought they could take advantage of me because I was young, because I was family, because they assumed I wouldn't fight back. They were about to learn how wrong they were. The next few days were a whirlwind of phone calls, emails, and an overwhelming mix of emotions. Danny sat with me one evening, helping me sort through old bank statements to gather evidence for the lawyer. "I still can't believe they had the audacity to take it," she said, shaking her head as she highlighted the suspicious transfer. "Like, who does that? And for Emily of all people. Doesn't she already get everything handed to her?" I nodded, biting the inside of my cheek to keep from snapping the pen I was holding. "She's never had to work for anything in her life, and now they're acting like I'm the selfish one for wanting my money back." "Well, you're doing the right thing," Danny said firmly. "They're counting on you feeling guilty, but you don't owe them anything. This was theft, plain and simple." The lawyer, Rebecca, agreed. During our first formal meeting, she reviewed the documents I'd brought and nodded approvingly. "This is more than enough to support your case," she said. "Since Edward transferred the money from your account without explicit permission, it qualifies as unauthorized use of funds. We'll start by sending a demand letter." I leaned forward in my chair. "And if they ignore it?" "Then we escalate," she said simply. "But trust me, most people respond when the legal system gets involved. They're likely panicking already." The thought of Edward and Margaret scrambling to cover their tracks gave me a grim sense of satisfaction. For years, they'd treated me like an afterthought, prioritizing Emily at every turn. Now, they'd finally have to face the consequences. The demand letter arrived at their house 3 days later. I imagined the scene. Edward opening the envelope, his smug smile fading as he read the contents. Margaret pacing the kitchen, wringing her hands and muttering about ungrateful children. Emily, oblivious as always, lounging in her dorm room with no idea what was happening. It didn't take long for the fallout to reach me. My phone buzzed late that evening, Edward's name flashing on the screen. I debated ignoring it, but decided to pick up, my curiosity winning out. "What the hell is this, Clarice?" he barked the moment I answered. "You sent a lawyer after us?" I took a deep breath, keeping my voice steady. "I did. You stole my money, Edward. This is me holding you accountable." "Stole?" he repeated, his tone dripping with incredulity. "We're family. It was a loan." "No, it wasn't," I said sharply. "You didn't ask me. You didn't even tell me. You just took it." Margaret's voice cut in from the background. "Clarice, you're being ridiculous. We did this for Emily. She needed help." "And I didn't?" I shot back. "Do you have any idea how hard I worked for that money? How much I gave up to save it? You had no right." Edward scoffed. "You're young. You can earn it back. This is a waste of everyone's time." "I guess we'll let the courts decide that," I said before hanging up. Their defiance only fueled my resolve. Rebecca filed the formal complaint the next day, citing unauthorized use of funds and breach of trust. "This should get their attention," she said as she emailed me the court documents. "If they refuse to repay the full amount, we'll move forward with legal proceedings." As word of the situation spread, I started hearing from extended family. Margaret had apparently told them I was being unreasonable, framing herself and Edward as selfless parents who'd made a tough decision for the good of the family. But I wasn't about to let their narrative go unchecked. During one particularly heated phone call, my aunt tried to intervene. "Clarice, you have to see it from their perspective," she said. "They were just trying to help Emily. Isn't that what family does?" "Family doesn't steal from each other," I replied coldly. "They could have asked me. They didn't. They just took what they wanted and assumed I wouldn't fight back. There was a long pause before she muttered, "Well, I suppose you have a point." Meanwhile, Danny became my lifeline. She stayed up late with me, going over Rebecca's updates and helping me stay focused. "I know it's exhausting," she said one night, as we sat in my living room, surrounded by paperwork. "But you're almost there. They're already cracking under the pressure." She wasn't wrong. Margaret had started sending me long, rambling texts, alternating between guilt-tripping and pleading for forgiveness. "We didn't mean to hurt you. Can't we just move on from this?" One message read. Another said, "Why are you dragging us through this? Emily's education is important. Don't you want her to succeed?" Edward, on the other hand, doubled down on his arrogance. When Rebecca contacted him for a statement, he refused to cooperate, insisting the money was family property and that I had no claim to it. "Let him dig his own grave," Rebecca said when I told her. "The courts don't look kindly on people who justify theft as a family matter." The breaking point came when Emily finally found out what was happening. She called me out of the blue, her tone more annoyed than apologetic. "Why are you making such a big deal about this?" she asked. "It's not like you needed the money right away." "Do you even hear yourself?" I snapped. "That money wasn't yours, it wasn't Edward's, it wasn't Margaret's, it was mine. And you're benefiting from something that was stolen from me." "Well, what do you want me to do about it?" she said, clearly exasperated. "Nothing," I replied. "I want them to do something about it. And trust me, they will." By the time the court date was set, Edward and Margaret were visibly unraveling. Rebecca had built a strong case, and with the mounting pressure of legal fees and the looming possibility of a formal judgment, they finally reached out to discuss a settlement. "We'll pay you back," Edward said begrudgingly during the mediation. "But this is ridiculous, Clarice. You're tearing the family apart over a misunderstanding." "No," I corrected him. "You tore this family apart the moment you decided my hard work didn't matter. This is me fixing it." The mediation room was stark and sterile, the kind of place that didn't allow for illusions. Edward sat across the table from me, arms crossed, his face a mask of frustration. Margaret sat beside him, wringing her hands and avoiding my gaze. Rebecca, my lawyer, sat confidently at my side, flipping through the stack of documents that outlined every detail of their betrayal. The mediator, a middle-aged woman with a calm but firm demeanor, began the session. "We're here to resolve the dispute between Clarice and Edward and Margaret Reynolds regarding the unauthorized transfer of $10,000 from Clarice's account. Both parties will have the opportunity to present their positions, and will work toward a settlement that satisfies both sides." "Let me start by saying this is a huge misunderstanding," Edward said, leaning forward. His tone was measured, but the tension in his voice was unmistakable. "We didn't steal anything. We moved the money to help our other daughter Emily with her tuition. Clarice is young, she has plenty of time to save more." Rebecca didn't even flinch. "You transferred $10,000 out of her account without her permission," she said, her voice cutting through his excuses. "That's not a misunderstanding. That's theft." Edward smirked, but it didn't reach his eyes. "It's family money. We're all part of the same household. I didn't think we needed to ask for permission." "You didn't think you needed to ask," Rebecca repeated, her tone incredulous. "Even though the account was in Clarice's name and she was the sole contributor?" Margaret finally spoke up, her voice shaky. "We didn't mean to hurt her. We just thought—" "That she wouldn't notice? That she wouldn't care?" I interrupted, my voice cold. "You thought you could take what I worked for and call it a family decision. That's not how this works." The mediator raised a hand to stop the back and forth. "Let's focus on the facts," she said, her tone firm. "Clarice, your position is that the $10,000 was yours, earned through your work, and transferred without your consent. Is that correct?" "Yes," I said, holding my gaze steady. "It was my money, saved over years of working multiple jobs. I didn't agree to any of this." "And Edward," the mediator continued, You claim the transfer was made in good faith, with the intention of helping your other daughter? That's right, he said, his voice sharp. It wasn't malicious. We were just trying to help Emily. Then why didn't you ask me first? I shot back. Why did you lie and say it was going into a higher interest account? Edward opened his mouth, but no words came out. For the first time, he looked genuinely cornered. Rebecca took over, sliding a document across the table. This is the transaction record showing the unauthorized transfer. It clearly states that Edward accessed the account without notifying Clarice. Additionally, we have screenshots of text messages where he admits to using the money for Emily's tuition. There's no ambiguity here. Margaret paled as the mediator examined the evidence. Edward's jaw tightened, his bravado fading. We didn't think it would be such a big deal, he muttered, almost to himself. It's a big deal, I said, my voice steady but firm. You didn't just take money. You took my trust. And now you're trying to justify it instead of owning up to what you did. The mediator set down the document and folded her hands. Edward, Margaret, based on the evidence presented, it's clear that the funds were transferred without Clarice's consent. While I understand your intentions, your actions violated her financial autonomy. The recommendation is for full repayment, along with any associated legal fees incurred by Clarice. Margaret gasped softly, but Edward didn't move, his face a mask of controlled fury. How are we supposed to come up with that kind of money? He asked, his voice tight. That's not my problem, I said coldly. Figure it out, just like I had to figure out how to save it in the first place. After a tense silence, the mediator spoke again. If you agree to the repayment, we can settle this here today. Otherwise, Clarice has the option to pursue a civil lawsuit, which could result in further financial penalties. Edward exhaled sharply, glaring at me like I was the one who had wronged him. Fine, he said through gritted teeth. We'll pay her back. The mediator nodded, sliding a settlement agreement across the table. Please review and sign. As they scrawled their signatures, Margaret looked up at me, her eyes filled with something between anger and sadness. We didn't mean for it to come to this, she said quietly. It didn't have to, I replied, meeting her gaze. You made the choice to take what wasn't yours. I'm just making sure you face the consequences. Walking out of that room, I felt a mix of emotions, relief, vindication, and a lingering sadness for what could never be repaired. Rebecca placed a reassuring hand on my shoulder as we headed to the elevator. You handled that perfectly, she said. They're lucky you didn't push for more. They'll pay for what they did, I said. That's all I wanted. But deep down, I knew it was about more than the money. It was about proving to myself that I wouldn't let anyone, not even my own family, treat me like I didn't matter. The check arrived in my account 2 weeks later, the first of several payments outlined in the settlement agreement. It wasn't the full $10,000 yet, but seeing even a fraction of my money returned felt like a victory. For the first time in weeks, I breathed a little easier. It wasn't just about the money. It was about knowing I had taken a stand. Margaret called the day after the transfer. Her voice was softer this time, almost apologetic. Clarice, she began, hesitating, we've started making the payments. I hope this means we can start moving on. I didn't respond immediately, choosing my words carefully. Moving on isn't just about paying me back, I said. It's about understanding what you did and why it was wrong. We didn't mean to hurt you, she said quickly. We were just trying to help Emily. You keep saying that, I replied, my tone even. But you didn't ask. You didn't even think about how it would affect me. That's what hurts the most. She sighed heavily, and for a moment I thought she might finally take responsibility. But then she said, You're young, Clarice. You have your whole life ahead of you to rebuild. Can't we just put this behind us? I clenched my jaw, feeling the familiar frustration bubbling up. This isn't about being young or old, Mom. It's about respect, and if you can't understand that, maybe we're not ready to move on. Her silence spoke volumes. Danny came over that evening with a bottle of wine to celebrate the first payment. To holding people accountable, she said, raising her glass with a grin. To never letting anyone take advantage of me again, I replied, clinking my glass against hers. As we talked, I realized just how much this experience had changed me. For years, I'd let Margaret and Edward's dismissive attitudes chip away at my confidence, convincing myself that standing up to them wasn't worth the fight. But now I knew better. Setting boundaries didn't make me selfish. It made me strong. A few weeks later, I got a message from Emily. It was brief and awkward, a half-hearted apology for her role in everything. I didn't know they were using your money. I'm sorry if I benefited from it, she wrote. I didn't bother replying. Whether she knew or not didn't change the fact that she had been complicit in a system that put her needs above mine. Forgiveness might come eventually, but not yet. Edward predictably stayed silent. He made the payments on time but didn't reach out, his pride likely keeping him from acknowledging the situation any further. That was fine by me. I wasn't interested in mending fences with someone who saw me as little more than a resource to exploit. As the payments continued to roll in, I started to feel like I could breathe again. I adjusted my budget, reopened my savings account, and set new goals for the future. The betrayal still stung, but it no longer consumed me. Instead, it fueled me, reminding me of my own resilience and the importance of protecting what I'd worked so hard to build. The money would eventually add up, but the sense of empowerment I'd gained from standing up for myself was priceless. Months later, as the final payment hit my account, I stared at the total balance with a mixture of pride and relief. My savings were whole again, not just the money I'd worked so hard for, but the validation that came with reclaiming what was rightfully mine. It felt like a new chapter, one where I finally had control over my future. I treated myself to a quiet celebration that evening. No big parties, no extravagant purchases, just a simple toast in the comfort of my apartment. I'd rebuilt what they had tried to take from me, and the lessons I'd learned in the process were worth even more than the money. Margaret called again shortly after the final payment. This time her tone was measured, almost careful. "Clarice," she began, "I know we've had our differences, but I hope we can move forward now." "Moving forward means respecting me," I said, my voice calm but firm. "Not just my money, but my decisions, my boundaries, my autonomy. If you can't do that, there's nothing to move forward to." There was a pause on her end, long enough for me to wonder if she'd finally heard me. "I'll try," she said quietly. "I really will." It wasn't a perfect apology, but it was a start. I didn't respond with forgiveness. It would take time to rebuild trust, but I felt a flicker of hope that maybe one day our relationship could be mended. For now, though, I was focused on myself. Danny and I sat on the balcony of my apartment a few weeks later, sipping wine as the sun set. She raised her glass and said, "So what's next for the amazing Clarice? Big plans?" I smiled, feeling lighter than I had in months. "I'm not sure yet," I admitted. "Maybe it's time to finally go back to school. Or maybe I'll invest in something I've always wanted. All I know is that whatever I do next, it'll be on my terms." "To your terms," she said, clinking her glass against mine. As I drifted off to sleep that night, I thought about the journey that had brought me here. Edward and Margaret had underestimated me, thinking I'd let their betrayal slide because of family ties. But I'd proven them wrong. I'd stood up for myself, reclaimed what was mine, and walked away stronger for it. The money in my account wasn't just a number. It was a symbol of my resilience, my independence, and my ability to fight for what I deserved. Whatever came next, I knew I was ready. And this time, no one would take it away from me.